Afternoon, everybody. A little bit different today. It's not morning, it's nice and afternoon. Welcome to our fourth and final webinar on organizational resilience. I really appreciate all of you making time to attend this workshop. I hope everyone is still keeping well and keeping safe. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. I hope you have fun today. And for those of you returning, thank you again so much for staying in touch between webinars, sending me questions, sending me WhatsApps. It's been really, really cool. So thank you for that. Just some housekeeping. If you could please keep your microphones on mute. And then today in the Q&A section, you'll see it on the right-hand side of the screen. If you wouldn't mind just kind of sharing with us who you are, where you're checking in from. We're going to use the Q&A during the session if you have questions or if you have a comment. So please feel free to post it there. So let's see who we've got here. Debbie from Durban. So Debbie is with me today on this session. My name is Nadine Rix. I'm the National Risk Officer from BDO South Africa. I'm lucky to have a couple of production ladies in the back that are really, really great at helping me out at running this on Teams. We've got Londiwe in Joburg, I've got Justine in Cape Town, and then Debbie from Durban that you all saw there today. Before we get going, I'm going to do a quick recap just on what we spoke of in the previous sessions. Please be reminded that copies of the slides are available, and then the recordings are also on the BDO website. So the recordings of the previous slides and webinars you can find there. Hello, Mareike from Cape Town. You are welcome. Thank you so much. All right, so yeah, Mareike, feel free to use the Q&A, and for those of the other attendees, as we go along, I'll make pit stops and check in with the audience. So for now, we should all be fairly familiar with the resilience framework. We speak about the concept of organizational resilience, that being the ability of the company to anticipate, to prepare for, to respond and adapt to incremental changes, as well as then disruptions, what we've been going through. So we look at creating resilience then to survive and prosper. And during this time, we focused on then data, which is the first element of the framework. With data, here we look at how organizations collect data, what they need to be collecting, how it must be stored, making sure that we maintain the integrity of data, and also the accuracy, very important. The second element in the framework is systems. So this is how the business and people then interact with this data. The systems are there to help us make sense of everything going on around us, and it deals with things like business analytics. We look at dashboard reporting, we look at communication systems, and then of course creating that agility and adaptability in the organization. The last element, as you can see on your screens, is trust. Here we explore relationships we have internally and externally. We question the commitment that people have to the overall goals, how we manage conflicts, how we hold each other accountable, and then also establishing trust through the sharing of our shared values and vulnerabilities. I think in this time, everybody is going through a bit of a flip emotionally. So we build trust by actually sharing and connecting with people, which is very important in building organizational resilience. So the first one, we just did an introductory session to the framework. The second one, we looked then at strategy and leadership. So how do we actually take this framework when we look at strategy and leadership, and how do we build resilient strategies? Last week, we looked at business development and creating some business development resilience. And today we're going to look at operational resilience. I see our audience is growing quite nicely. Thank you, Esme and Graham. I see Graham is also in Cape Town. Right, so let's get going with operations for today. So, we can loosely define operations as kind of everything that happens in the company to keep it running day to day. Business plans often have a separate section that details operational functionality, and it's typically the things that are non-revenue generating. So it can speak to equipment, we look at people, we look at processes, everything that is needed for the business to execute strategy and any kind of goals that it has. So, operations will obviously vary depending on whether the organization is in retail, manufacturing, technology, services, industries will look vastly different. So how these organizations build resilience into their operations, it's largely dependent on the organizational maturity. Sometimes leadership views can also have an impact on it. The size of the organization has an impact on it. So we're going to have a little bit of a look today. Typically in operations, what we speak of in generalist terms. We look at the legal and regulatory frameworks. That's become quite a hot topic in recent months. We look at business continuity, risk management, quality matters is quite important. Where we don't have products, we look at service management, and then of course information technology and information security, which has also become a lot more prevalent in recent months, especially with everybody working remotely. Who typically is responsible for this? So a lot of companies have different organizational structures, but typically you'll have a legal and risk department. Some companies have then, in addition to that, internal audit functions. We have procurement that will fall sometimes under warehousing, depending on what they buy. And then if you're in manufacturing or production, that will be a subset of it. Distribution to make sure that our goods get to our clients. Typically, there'll be a quality control unit. And then again, our CRO and our ITC departments are quite important. So that's just loosely, when we talk of operations today, when I speak of that, that's kind of the framework that we're going to be using when we look at the operations. So the way in which I'm going to do today, last week we introduced the GROW model. I'm going to use the same one for when we go to today. The GROW model, we first of all have to set our goal. We then explore the different realities on ground. We weigh up all the options to make sure that we have enough solutions and flexibility built into possible options to solving our problem and to reaching our goals. And then at the end of the day, establishing who's responsible for what and when they need to do it. So when we talk operations, I'm going to take a very simple one for today. I'm going to look at regulatory compliance. So a lot of organizations are struggling to get their heads wrapped around it because all of a sudden we have a lot of changes in a lot of industries. I know BDO, being an audit firm, there's obviously changes in terms of the JSE. There's new standards coming out. SICA are sending us guidance in terms of, deadline extensions. There's tax that are changing. So a lot of industries all of a sudden very aware of their regulatory environment. So when we have this goal of regulatory compliance, I kind of took it because it's standard, I think, across most organizations. The realities here is, do we know what we need to comply with? So because of all these changes, are we aware of the data that we need to collect? So here we look at data, what it is that we need to collect. Industry-related data would relate to regulatory bodies. In our case, it's the IRBA. If you're in financial services, excuse me, if you're in financial services, it will be the Financial Services Board. Banks obviously have their regulatory bodies. So it spans across different industries. And then also your legislative requirements. So tax laws is quite important. Any kind of legislation that's in your environment. When it comes to the organization, here we look at things like the Companies Act, King Code of Corporate Governance. If you're a listed company, obviously the JSE has certain standards that you have to adhere to. People, conditions of employment, your Labour Act, these days health and safety, so occupational health and safety has come to the forefront. Any kind of systems that your people use. We know in South Africa, most recently, the POPIA legislation has come into effect. So making sure that our data privacy is up to scratch and our data protection is up to scratch, that we protect our people in terms of that legislation. Processes, typically when we look at manufacturing and production, there could be some quality management processes that are in place, any kind of ISO standards that we need to adhere to. And then systems, again, as I said, making sure that we comply if there's any kind of security systems or security protocols, legislation that we need to adhere to, that's quite important. So that gives us an idea of the landscape, that we need to consider when we look at what data should I be collecting, where should I be focusing. And then where I find this data in my organization, it typically will be aligned with policy. So if we take the example of, the conditions of employment, organizations will have employee contracts or, service contracts. We need to make sure that that's in line with the labor relations. Different standards, we could have our own standards in our organizations, our terms and conditions that we have with clients. There will be aspects of legislation and regulatory in there. Contracts, so contracts, letters, communication that we have, all of these places are possible instances where there is data in our organization that needs to be aligned with the changes that are currently taking place. So we can already see, just in a simple goal such as regulatory compliance, quite a bit of work that we have to do. So that's just touching on the element of data. When we then look at the systems and processes, the second element of the resilience framework, here we really look at how they interact with what is out there. So do we have, for example, monitoring and evaluation? If we have a certain manufacturing process that needs to adhere to certain standards, is there an effective monitoring and evaluation system in place that alerts us in issues where there's non-compliance? Do we have quality control and review procedures? Now, in the audit world, we've got quite strict quality control and reviews that take place to ensure that we adhere to all of the standards in our industry. We look at things like exception reporting. How often does it happen? And then more importantly, is anything done about the exceptions that are found? There's no point in having exception reporting if nobody actually goes and fixes the problem. Change management, this speaks to, again, if there's a change in the industry, a change in the standard, change in legislation, how is this rolled out? Is it automatically rolled out to our organization? And then communication and public relations. So if something does go wrong, do we have a system that automatically kicks in, or a process, people responsible for doing these things? Across our organization, we can do this through dashboard monitoring. So I log in the morning and I immediately see, where there's been changes overnight. People here are quite important when it comes to non-compliance. I've oftentimes found when we do ISO reviews that they don't want to share the non-compliance because, they kind of think it's a bad thing. I'm like, well, non-compliance is where we learn. That's where we learn from our mistakes. We identify possible failures, so it's very important that we note all of those things down, that there's a chain of events and a chain of communication that we can follow. When we look then at built-in processes, this is where we typically look at something like, if I take my procurement system. So let's say there's been a change in the VAT rate. So now the change comes through, and in my contracts and in my invoices, all of this now has to be updated. And it's best if those things can be updated automatically, provided I've mapped out where in my organization these changes should be affected. With something like POPIA, if I have electronic terms and conditions, if I have contracts or engagement letters with clients that is affected by that, it would be great if that could be automatically affected through a system. So that's the importance of looking at systems and processes when it comes to regulatory compliance. It's the monitoring element of it, it's managing the change, and it's making sure that the change is affected all across the organization. So before I move on to the next part, I'm going to quickly check in with the audience here to find out, do we have any questions up to here? Oh, I see Nicole's also here. Shalil from the Durban office. Francis, hello Francis, thank you so much for checking in. So just asking my audience here, I've got Michael coming in. All right, so Michael, can you give us another example of how data and systems would interact here to achieve regulatory compliance? Okay, let's take, that's a good question. If I take, for example, a bank, we've had a number of interest rate changes, and that's obviously a legislative requirement that they have to implement. So from the bank side, everywhere that would be affected by that interest rate, they would have to make sure that that change is effected. So all of the loans that they've got, any kind of like communication to clients. So, for example, there could be an electronic emailing system where if there's a change in interest rate, I automatically have a bunch of letters that go out to my clients to tell them, this is the new interest rate and this is how it affects your loans. So all of these things can be automated, which is great. Instead of somebody sitting manually trying to figure out, who must I let know, and who does it affect. So that's typically something where a regulatory change or legislative change has quite a significant impact on a business, and they need to make sure that it's applied all around, because there's no point in telling a client, the interest rates change, but yet when I get my statement, I see that they haven't changed it yet and they haven't updated it yet. So that's an example that we can use. I hope that's a good enough example. Let me just see here. All right, so I've got Alun from Cape Town. Welcome, thank you very much. Okay, so that's just a bit on the interaction of data systems and processes when we look at operations, and specifically now we looked at the element of operations which speaks to regulatory compliance. All right, so what I'm going to move to next, we've spent quite a bit of time on the framework. We've spent a lot of time on looking at data systems and processes, and now I'm going to talk about something that we haven't really discussed previously, which I do think has a massive effect on how we achieve organizational resilience in a company, and that's called organizational culture. So when we speak organizational culture, that's obviously the values. It's the way in which they do business, it's the way that they interact. And for now, I'm going to go back to the Q&A again. I'm going to ask my audience to tell me, how could organizational culture affect the development of resilience, or hamper the development of resilience? So it can either be a good thing, where it can, really urge on the development of resilience, or where in your environment has there kind of been organizational culture that's really hampered the development of resilience. We've been talking about this for quite some time. We're kind of well away into this pandemic now. So just in your experience, if you can just share with me, Sharon, okay, management is reluctant to change. Michael again to say no creativity, no experimentation. So I would imagine that those are both instances in which I would say the culture has really hampered the creation of organizational resilience or the development of it, because, change is quite an important thing. And if people want to forge ahead and do business the way they've been doing it for the last 20 years because that's how it's done, I don't think they're going to survive for much longer. No creativity, no experimentation, so people aren't actually allowed to explore different avenues. The organization is typically a follower. Okay, I like that one. So there's nothing wrong, I think, with being a follower, but I think in these instances it would be, if we knew what we were following, or if anybody actually had a defined recipe for how to overcome this, I think it would stand you in good stead to follow. But I think, in this instance, it could be a bit of a problem to kind of like wait around to see what others are doing before we make a move. An example is the abuse of sick leave by staff. Oof, yeah, that's definitely something where I think organizational culture is going to hamper the development of resilience. We need to be able to trust our staff. One of the foundations being trust and developing that trust. Obviously, if people are not going to take ownership, that can definitely do that. Management not trusting staff. I think that in combination with the fact that people abuse their leave is a problem. Poor handover when staff leave, definitely. That's definitely something that would hamper the development of resilience, because again, when somebody leaves, now all of a sudden the whole thing falls apart, all the wheels come off. So that's a very, very good one. I'm going to go over here to the published ones. For handover, oh, sorry, I'm moving the wrong way around. I should move up and not down. Okay. And then we have staff don't feel valued, yes, when they have the bare minimum to survive. I think that is critical. In this time, we really need to try and connect with people. I know a lot of organizations have kind of, we've kind of seen two schools of organizations, if you will. One side was organizations that absolutely did everything to protect their people and protect their staff. And on the other hand, we have organizations that went for the money, immediately entered into, job cuts and staff cuts, expenditure cutting. And we're seeing trends worldwide that the ones that chose people seem to be the ones that are enduring this pandemic a little bit better than the ones that went just straight for the money. So I think that's a very valid point. Even if people, if the organization can't necessarily afford to pay you full salary, that there's still that sense of value and of purpose, and that what I do makes a difference. Okay, so thank you very much for that. I think we have a fair idea of, the importance of organizational culture when it comes to the development of resilience. And I think with this as well, the role that we can play. If I'm in a position where I can abuse leave, but I don't, I can aid or I can help on the creation of resilience. If I know I'm going to leave my job, make sure that I hand over properly to the person, who's going to be next. So I think it's important that we can all play a part and not just wait for the organization to take over. There's something that we can do as individuals, which I quite like. Right, thank you very much for that. What I'm going to do now is, so in looking at all of this and in looking at, organizational culture and the role that it does play in the development of resilience, and because I do think when we talk operational resilience, it boils down 90% to the people that we have. Yes, we can have production and manufacturing and all these things, but it's really people that run the business. So what I did is I found this really, really cool research done by the BSI Institute, BSI Group, sorry. You can have a look on their website. It's really, really nice. And they've been doing research on organizational resilience and organizational culture and kind of like the mergence of the two. And what they found in the last 40 years, that there's definite phases to the creation of resilience. There's phases in terms of how it's developed. So what they say is in the beginning, when we start kind of looking at resilience, there's very much a preventative control. So protecting that, what I have, that can either be done through physical barriers. There's lots of redundancy built in, there's backups, there's standardized procedures and everything to protect the organization from the threats and allow it to bounce back from disruption. So very much a protective environment, keep safe what I have. And then as it kind of then starts progressing and as the organization gets a bit more mature, we then have what is called mindful action. So this is where resilience is produced by people who they would notice a threat and they would react to it. So a lot more, alert of what is going on in their environment. So where the first one was very constrictive and consistent, here we move to a bit of a flexible approach where people are now allowed, or people actually come forward and they notice things and they kind of start responding to it. So soon we learned that, once that started happening, people realized that resilience is not just about bouncing back, it's also about bouncing forward, or in these days, I heard the term the other day, crawling forward. So how to grow and prosper in the future. And again, we see two phases here where we have performance optimization, again, through standardized processes and procedures. We look at improving and refining our existing competencies. We enhance the ways that we work. We exploit the current technologies, all to serve our customers and markets. So it's very progressive, but it's very consistently applied. And then the second to last phase is what we have, adaptive innovation. So this is where organizational resilience is created through, creative thinking and inventing and, exploring new markets. And people have realized that they don't have to be the victims to disruption. They can actually be the disruption. So that's just a little bit about the maturity on let's say the movement of organizational resilience and organizational resilience thinking as the company matures over time. So I thought this was quite interesting. The last element then is paradoxical thinking, and this is where it gets tricky. So this means that we have to balance all of these different ways of thinking about resilience. And what they then did is they put together a resilience tension quadrant. So on the one hand, what they realized is you've got these two polar opposite sides of thinking about the resilience. On the one side, there's the defensive, so to protect what I have and protecting the results. And then on the other hand, there's the progressive one, where we want to achieve and we want to grow and want to prosper. On the other side of this quadrant, then again, two polar opposites is where we see consistency. So this is standardized processes, procedures, ways in which we do things. Typically, you know, in organizations that would be, or when somebody has a new idea, somebody says, oh no, you know, I've been here for 5 years, and once you've got my experience, you know, then we'll listen to you. So there's that, you know, consistency in the thinking. And then on the opposite side of that, of course, is flexibility, which is more and more needed, you know, where we are today. So these four viewpoints then form this integral part of this tension quadrant. And resilience is achieved by actually balancing, you know, the preventative controls, the mindful action, you know, and all of these things that kind of go on to safeguard our organizations. During this time, though, businesses do rely heavily on our leaders to make sure that they balance these things. You know, we've been kind of thrust into an environment where we've had to quickly analyze our existing competencies. We've either had to exploit or develop new technologies. We've had to keep innovating. And, you know, there's a huge kind of like reliance on our leaders to actually help manage all of this. So when we then look at that, a question that I want to throw out to my audience now is if we look at, you know, balancing all of these tensions and moving through the continuing disruption that we are currently in, what do you think this means for the leaders in our current organizations? And I don't necessarily mean, you know, the leaders at the top. It doesn't have to be a hierarchy, but in balancing this, what does this mean for leadership when it comes to culture, communication in an organization? So I'm going to leave you with that question. You know, kind of like what is expected of our leaders here? I'm going to go to my Q&A. Okay. Sorry, Bertie, I missed your previous comment here. I'll get back to that one just now. So on this one from leaders, what do we expect from our leaders when it looks at, you know, balancing these tensions? We know these tensions exist. I'm sure a lot of you have experienced it. This is not new. You know, that consistency versus being flexible. Let me just quickly see here if we've got some comments from our audience. Okay. All right. Oops, sorry, I missed it here. Okay, there we've got it. Yes, leaders need to be able to communicate. That's very true. Leaders need to be able to communicate. I think in terms of communication, it's key. You know, if they change all of a sudden, if it's a very, let's say, old school type organization where everything goes through a ton of red tape processes before something happens, if that's going to change, the leaders need to be able to communicate that very, very clearly and communicate why that change is needed, right? Got another one coming in to say leaders have to trust their workforce. Yes, I think trust is one thing, but also leaders need to allow people to come forward with ideas on how to kind of manage this. You know, that becomes quite important as well. I've got Philip that asks, what kind of leadership style has proven most effective in times of change? Right, Philip, yeah, that's a good question. I think if I look at where we're at, I think the two leadership styles that currently come to my mind is a balance between situational leadership, where leaders look at the situation which they find themselves in and they lead to that. It's a bit risky because, you know, I think a lot of leaders find themselves with staff not knowing what they want at this point in time. Just looking at myself, you know, one day I want one thing, one day I want something else. So I think a balance between situational leadership and transformational leadership. So transformational leadership speaks to where we actually transform the organization, we transform the people that we're dealing with. So I think it's a mix between those two things. I've got Anonymous saying, yes, be brave and listen to staff. I can't say this enough. I think leaders oftentimes assume that they know, or they feel like they should be in the position where they do know. And I think oftentimes, the guys working on the shop floor and in the warehouse sometimes know a lot better practically what could work. So instead of assuming, leaders should really ask those pertinent questions. Right, so thank you for that. I think here, yes, building trust is very important, as we said, in terms of communicating. So clear communication. They need to be able to hold people accountable for what they're doing. Training and education becomes a continuous loop that we go through. If I go back to the goal of compliance, yes, everybody needs to be committed to that. So not just do I comply and make sure that those around me comply. I admit in instance where I haven't complied so that that can be dealt with. Creating a learning environment, yes, definitely a continuous loop. And then knowledge management, coming back to, I think it was Francis that said earlier, when we hand over, poor handover, when somebody leaves. I think knowledge management for where we are today is absolutely critical. Knowing who knows what, where it's stored, where do we keep it. It's really, really important to build that resilience. Stakeholder engagement, I think our leaders do have a responsibility to kind of nurture relationships. And again, I don't mean leaders in the sense of hierarchical executives and CEOs or CFOs, anybody at this point in time for me that can connect on an emotional level, show empathy, we really need that. Networking and seeking new industry connections. We spoke last week when we did business development about, entering new markets. So what is there out there for us? Clear communication again with our stakeholders. And I think this is a great space for collaboration between private and public enterprise. I think back years ago when I worked in Nigeria, we were under heavy pressure from the regulators. I worked for MTN and they were pressurized to monitor the call quality. So the regulator put out these standards to say, your calls have to comply to these quality standards. And if they don't comply to the quality standards, you're going to be a fine is going to be imposed upon you because you can't charge people for these call rates or the call rates that we're charging and the quality is not good enough. So they put out the legislation. But what we quickly realized was that in terms of the technology, they had very little capacity to actually accurately monitor our calls. And we knew that because we had the systems to do that. So what then happened is we collaborated with the regulator and we said, you know what, let's invest in the systems and the technology. Let's upskill everybody from the regulatory side and let's build something where you can then regulate the entire industry and not just MTN. Any kind of new entrants into the market that are going to play in that data space or voice or IP, that's very important. So we collaborated between private and public enterprise to actually, make sure that the entire industry benefits from it and your customers are protected through it. And I do think we're in that space now again. Right. So with that, the other thing that I think we need to look at is when COVID kind of happened and when we entered this pandemic, about 2-3 months later, everybody was like, we're not going to talk about it anymore. We're going to move to something else. And 6 months, 7 months, a year later, for some countries, we are still in it. So I think a reality is that this is going to be continuous uncertainty. I don't think the end is in sight. I think, there's a lot of uncertainty around the lockdown periods that we're in globally. There's the second and third waves that are coming. There's medical and economical uncertainty. People say rebound to the new normal, and now there's rebound to the new abnormal. So I think one of the realities that we have to consider, aside just from data, systems and processes, organizational culture, is definitely this continuous uncertainty. We shouldn't underestimate, that is definitely still a part of it. I found this quote as well that I'd like to share, which I think it kind of ties in nicely with organizational maturity as well. And that's the capacity to endure uncertainty. I think we definitely need to get comfortable with this uncertainty that we're in to enable us also to move forward. All right, so with that, I'm just going to kind of like capture or summarize what we've discussed. So I think the goal, it needs to be fit for purpose. Organizational resilience is there's no single recipe, you know, one size fits all, if you can put it that. I think leaders need to find the balance between preventative control. You know, we mentioned the mindful action, performance optimization is still key, and then the innovation, we need to be careful that we don't spend too money or unnecessarily in innovation because of where we're at. So I think it needs to be fit for purpose. When it comes to the realities, yes, I think continuous uncertainty is one that's going to be standard for how we approach this. Options, we need to make sure that we manage the tension that we spoke of, and we combat erosion. So erosion here is typically where we say, well, you know, we've now put in all the processes and procedures, we've spoken to everybody, so we're just going to let the ship run. However, if neglected, you know, companies will erode over time, and all of a sudden, I think they can just sleepwalk into disaster. You know, resilience is something that we continuously have to work on and we have to develop. And then, of course, the who, what, when, and where remaining key. So how this ties into the framework, and I'm just going to go through this in summary. Data, we need to understand what we need to collect, how it needs to be presented, how we store it, make sure we keep it safe. Systems here, when it comes to operations, very important that we have monitoring systems in place, quality control, we're looking for improvement, we're looking for intelligence, and systems that enable business. That's where we're looking at the automation, you know, if there's a change in legislation, that it kind of flows through the organization without too much human intervention. And then trust, we spoke of, where everyone's committed to the results, we're aligned with our purpose, we know where we're going, we're vulnerable with each other, where we don't, you know, we talk about, you know, when we've done something wrong or when we've made a mistake, we own it. We have healthy debates in terms of solving problems, and of course people are empowered to actually do the job that they're meant to do and to look for areas of improvement. All right, so that's kind of like what I wanted to say in terms of the operational resilience. So what I'd like to do now is go through and ask you if you know of examples during this time. It can be colleagues, it can be your own organization, any example of resilient successes that you've seen in the last, let's say, 6 months. So I'm going to have you think just about, it can be an organization, it can be something you read, it can be an industry that you think has really successfully managed to be resilient in the last 6 months. I'm going to go to my Q&A and see what we've got there. So anybody that can kind of share with me an example of resilient success, even a personal resilient success. If you yourself has been challenged with your own resilience and you feel that you've worked hard at developing it, anything that you'd like to share with Ash at this point in time. Okay, just going to wait here for that to come through. Okay, so anybody have an example of an organization? And then whilst the comments are coming through, I'm going to ask my audience as well, if you know what a high reliability organization is. Can anybody in the audience tell me what is a high reliability organization? Let's see who we've got in the audience and whether they can tell me what is a high reliability organization. Oh, excuse me. Okay, I'm seeing some comments coming through. They are high-risk businesses. Okay, to an extent, they are prone to operate in high-risk environments. Yes. Okay. Oh, I love this, Francis. Yes. Okay, so Francis has got a success example. She says our systems being online instead of paper-based has assisted in keeping the firm going. Yes, that's a great example of how, you know, some firms have built in resilience over the last 6 months. I've got another one coming in here for high reliability. People depend on them, lives are at stake. Yes, that ties in very nicely with they are high-risk businesses, so high reliability organizations, yeah, operate in a high-risk environment. Let's just quickly see. They succeed in any circumstance. Yeah, that's quite close to the definition. They succeed in any circumstance, meaning that success is quite important for them. So, right, thank you very much. I'm going to go back to my slides here. So high reliability organizations, and why I want to talk about this is I've actually come across some very, very interesting research. And for me, it ties in so nicely with, what we're trying to create in terms of resilience. Because when we look, for example, of resilience, we're fairly much limited to what's been going on in the pandemic, and the research is quite new on that field. But if we look at high reliability organizations, these are organizations that have succeeded in avoiding catastrophes despite a very high level of risk and complexity. So if we go and look at those industries and those organizations, and they've been in existence for years, I think there's a great deal that we can learn from them in terms of how we build our resilience, just kind of like as a benchmark for success. So examples here include things like, nuclear power plants, air traffic control systems, naval aircraft carriers, space travel. I think most recently we need to add to the list healthcare operations, where it's a very, very high risk environment. There's now a whole host of complexities that are there. And in each event or in each industry, a minor event can result in absolutely catastrophic consequences. So I'm not saying that we all have to change to high reliability organizations. What I'm saying is there's a lot that we can learn from these organizations and how they've evolved to build our own resilience. And what was interesting when I looked at these is if you look at the factors that have been identified in these high reliability organizations, it speaks to a very high level of external awareness. So they're very aware of what's going on in their environment, what's going on around them, what's going on the outside, pretty similar to what we've had to become. We've had to become very aware of what are the lockdown legislations, what are the schools doing, are they opening, are they not opening, when can I exercise, when must I wear a mask, what are the symptoms, what changes has there been in legislation or, in my environment. So we've all of a sudden had to become very aware of the external changes around us. And these organizations also then show a very high tendency of self-awareness. So when they look internally, they've got their finger on the pulse of what is going on in the organization. And I think we're all kind of in that space at the moment. We look at knowledge management, who can do what, by when can they do it, really leaning in on each other. So that's why I wanted to just spend a few minutes on this to look at, how can we learn from them? So the first thing they've got is they've got a preoccupation with failure. If we look at the characteristics, they prioritize reliability, and they've got a healthy uneasiness. I love that word, about what could go wrong. They remain sensitive to this and to all possible threats. So they've got built-in redundancies, which are backup systems in case of failure. And through this, they also manage their relationships with their customers, suppliers, collaborators, all the internal, external, stakeholders. And when I read up on this, so the airline industry is obviously a high reliability organization. I don't know how many of you, I know we haven't flown in months, but I remember, when you sit down, you have that safety demonstration that comes up, and in the bigger aircraft, they had this on a video. So you'd sit and they would flick the switch to the video, and you'd have to watch the safety video in the aircraft. And I don't know how many of you noted that the air hostesses will stand in front of the plane or in the middle and in the back, and they kind of just look at us. And I always thought, I was asked the question, why do you think they look at us? And I always thought it was to make sure that we all watch the video, so that, everybody pays attention. And I was then told by somebody in the airline industry that they stand there so that in case the video fails, they can quickly take over, because the video is timed to play before takeoff. So if the video fails, they can't then everybody come forward and start over. So they're ready, in minute there's a technical failure, they can just carry on with that, emergency exit thing, so they can maintain the momentum so the plane can still take off in the time that it should. And I thought that was a great example of this preoccupation with failure to the smallest of detail. The next thing they've got is they've got a reluctance to simplify. They make deliberate attempts to create a very complete picture of the work that is going on, the work environment. They encourage diversity of opinion. They like the fact that there's alternative voices and perspectives that are coming out. And I think this is something that we can identify again. Looking at the past couple of webinars we've had, complexity is really all around us. And I think we would be, I think we would miss out on a lot of opportunity and solutions if we try to simplify the environment that we find ourselves in. Sensitivity to operations is the next characteristics, and here, we look at the leaders and staff. I think staff across the organization being aware of how their decisions would affect those in the organization. So, I can't just make a decision in HR and I roll it out without thinking how it's going to affect finance and marketing and so on. So they really they close all the loops when they make a decision on something. It really makes sure that they maintain the situational awareness, they maintain their processes, and they're sensitive, like when a new communication goes out, what the impact of all of this could be. They've got a commitment to resilience, recognizing that things will go wrong, which I think a lot of us don't want to admit, but they think, this will go wrong. And there will be things that go wrong that can't be predicted, but we're going to try and respond as quickly as possible to minimize the harm. So managers focus on strategic and tactical decisions. So there's, strategic is typically the longer term one, and then tactical is what do I have to immediately do now? And they seldom interfere with the operational issues that are delegated and covered by clear processes. So where there's a clear process in place, they trust that will work. And in instances where disruption then comes in, they've got quick tactical responses to that. This also means that the operational teams must be empowered and committed to that goal of resilience. Deference to expertise, I love this one. Here we speak of, in a normal circumstance, there would be a hierarchy in the organization, but in times of disruption, periods where there are emergencies and things like that, the organization doesn't migrate to this hierarchical structure. They go to a structure which leverages on the members within the organization to have that expertise. This is where something like deploying masks or sanitization to retailers, it's the guys on the ground that will know what could work and what doesn't work. So their knowledge and their expertise is leveraged, and they're empowered to do this instead of somebody sitting in an office somewhere trying to figure out how it's going to work. So I love the fact that in times of crisis, they literally leverage, at an operational level, the guys with the expertise to come and actually, help with the solutions. The last one is then continuous learning. So they continuously reinvent themselves, they respond to situations that evolve quickly, and they learn from their accidents. We spoke earlier on of being vulnerable and admitting instances of non-compliance or when you've made mistakes, because that's where the learning takes place. So they take these failures as learning opportunities while growing through them. There's a climate of continuous training. They study the impacts and the assumptions, they replan, they manage their data and the information. So I really think, this for me kind of summarized at the end of the webinar series when we speak of organizational resilience. I think this for me kind of summarizes, a lot of what we've been talking about. And I think for me, the comfort is there that, these guys have been doing it for years. We've kind of been thrust into this world where we have to create resilience, we have to respond tactically. And I think there's a lot of research there that we can actually learn from, which is great. So on this note, that's the end of the slides. I'm just going to ask quickly, can anybody think of, or can anybody share a story, again, recently maybe at work, where they might have seen this in action? I've got Francis coming to say, yes, BDO has gone with the clarity in place of simplicity. Yes, we're not going to simplify it. We're going to be clear about what it is that we're about. Thank you very much. Sharon says that movie, yes, that movie with Tom Hanks landing the plane on the Hudson River. Yes, that's clearly an example of, I think, definitely not. He didn't simplify the situation at all. He was sensitive to how it could affect the passengers. I do think he had the expertise to do what he did. But that typically where, the operational processes kicked in and it was so ingrained in him, that operational steps that he had to take were so ingrained in him that he could respond tactically to that. Our healthcare sector needs to move towards HRO. Yes, I agree. Anonymous, thank you for that. I think our healthcare sector needs a bit of an overhaul when it comes to this. I think we are dealing with complexities that we've never had to deal with before. So yes, I'm hoping that they're looking towards building resiliences and building this into how they function, because it is, at this point in time, people's lives are at stake. And I don't just think the people who have COVID's lives are at stake. Even if I just go to the doctor's office or if I go to the dentist, there's this heightened awareness. And I think they need to be preoccupied with the fact that, some things are going to fail. And what are we doing about that? All right. So with that, I'm going to thank you very, very much for your participation today. Please complete our survey. I think Londi is going to put a link for the satisfaction survey onto our website. If you can just click on that and tell us your views on the webinars. There will be a recording of this on the website, so you'll get an email with a link to that. And then, as I said, all the other recordings are on there as well. My email, my WhatsApp, please, those of you that have connected, it's been great, the conversations that we've had around not just organizational resilience, but personal resilience and the role that that's played. Let me just quickly see, I've got another new comment in here. Oh, sorry, no, that's an old one. My tech is failing me on this side. I see, Londi, you've put in the survey for us. So I'm going to please ask that the audience goes and click on that link and please fill our survey in. So yeah, if there are any other questions, please feel free to put in the Q&A. We've got a couple of minutes left. And then with that, I want to thank all of you for attending. I know a lot of you have attended all of the webinars, and I really, really appreciate that. I hope that, we could learn something, and I hope that we carry on these debates. From BDO's side, we are putting together a webpage where all of this content will be loaded. So if you'd like to interact with us, please feel free to do so. I think it's going to be here for some time to come. I don't think this topic is going to go away anytime soon, and we continue to learn and we continue to share. All right, so with that, I don't see any new comments coming in. Let me just make sure I've covered all of them. Please excuse me, it's sometimes a little bit difficult to manage the Q&A and my slides. As I said, I'm not that proficient with it yet. All right. Okay, thank you very much. And yeah, with that, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Tomorrow's Friday, that's always good. So yeah, please keep in touch. And again, thank you so much for tuning in. Bye-bye.